I just know you're ready to hear about a little crime. Welcome to Crime Daddies.
Warning, this podcast is hosted by two true crime dads that will talk about murder, drugs, rape, and offenses against children. We may crack jokes and make light of something so terrible that has happened, but it will never be about the victim or the victim's family. You have been warned. Welcome back to Crime Daddies, everybody. I am Hunter, and we are so thankful to have you back for another week with us. And to no surprise, we're going to bring you some more true crime.
We do it weekly. You guys know what we do. We're your crime daddies for a reason. We're talking about crime. So if you're ready for the story today, I'm talking about vampires, believe it or not.
So this is going to be kind of a new subcategory of true crime.
Yeah, it's a little bit. It doesn't really get all the way into the supernatural, but I'll keep you guys roped in. Are you ready?
Go ahead.
All right. So today on this episode, I'm going to take you to a place that's a little personal to me, and I'll tell you why. We are going to Murray, Kentucky. Now, if you've ever been there, Murray sits in the far western part of Kentucky, just a short drive from Tennessee and Illinois and Missouri. It's surrounded by rolling farmland, winding county roads, and some of the prettiest scenery you can find anywhere in the region. You're not really far from Kentucky Lake or the Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, where people from all over the Midwest come to fish, camp, and spend weekends on the water. It's the kind of place where everybody seems to know everybody, where strangers wave as they pass by, and where life just moves at a pace that's becoming harder and harder to find nowadays. For decades, Murray built a reputation that most towns would love to have. At one point in time, it was proudly voted, quote, the friendliest small town in America. And if you've ever spent any time there, it's easy to understand why. The downtown is full of locally owned businesses. People hold the door open for strangers, and neighbors still check in on one another. It's the kind of place where people choose to stay because they genuinely love calling it home. But Murray isn't just another quiet farming town anymore. The biggest reason for that is Murray State University.
Before you get too far involved, I got a story about one time I went to Murray with Jacob.
Oh, Lord.
So I found this truck that I was going to buy, and I said, Jacob, won't you drive me? Because if I buy this truck, obviously I'm going to have to drive it back.
Right.
So Jacob gets in this road, and he was going 20 over. And we get pulled over, right? But here's the kicker. I had a loaded handgun and $11,000 in cash on me. And we get pulled over in out-of-state plates with a loaded handgun and $11,000 in cash.
And I was bumbling because I was driving my fiance's car and I could not find her insurance. And I didn't even know Hunter had a firearm. Well, I knew Hunter had a firearm, but I had forgot until the police officer came up to my window and he asked for my insurance and I couldn't find it, but he took my license and he walked back and Hunter was looking at me and he's like, should I tell him about the firearm? And I was like, oh shit, dude, whoa. Oh my gosh, it was so stressful.
I said, it's not going to look good with a loaded handgun, $11,000 in cash.
No, we would look like one of the participants in a Crime Daddies episode.
Well, I just thought I'd tell you a little side story of the last time me and Jacob was in that part of the country.
Yeah, I was happy to go back. So speaking of Murray State University, that's where I went to college. And it really transformed that whole small town from a community that was focused on just local gatherings and made it more of a regional destination. Today, students come from all across Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Illinois, Indiana, and well beyond to attend school there. The campus has brought new businesses, restaurants, arts, athletics, and opportunities that have helped the town grow while still hanging on to that small town identity. And Murray State has quietly produced some pretty impressive alumni over the years. College Football Hall of Fame coach Frank Beamer got his coaching start there. NFL All-Pro linebacker Quincy Williams spent time at Murray State, and I actually met him at a Murray State football game after he got drafted, and I went out to eat Mexican after the football game, and he was there, and he paid for everybody's meal. It was pretty nice.
Sounds like a pretty stand-up guy.
That's what I'm saying. And if you're familiar with the TV show Good Luck Charlie on Disney Channel, the mom from that show, Lee Allen Baker, actually is born and raised in Murray, Kentucky as well. and she was actually one of the university's most notable graduates. So, while a lot of people still think of Murray as just another agriculture town, the university has steadily put this little corner of Western Kentucky on the national map. And then I showed up. And obviously, that's whenever Murray State got its it really hit big time, is whenever I came to town. Forget the famous athletes, the actors, and the coaches. Once I enrolled, the national attention went through the roof, guys. I'm telling you, I was like top dog on campus.
I think it's because John Morant was there.
Forget John Morant. No, I'm just joking.
How'd you forget John Morant?
I left him out because that's what everyone talks about. And I was bigger than Ja. No, I'm just joking. Ja Morant is one of the most notable alumni of Murray State University, for sure.
2019 NBA Rookie of the Year, by the way.
And the second pick in the draft, and like a two-time All-Star, and all this cool stuff. And I met him a few times. He's a really down-to-earth guy. And I remember there was people I went to college with, because Ja Morant left the summer before I enrolled. He got drafted in the summer of 2019, and I didn't start until the fall 2019. But there was one time while he was in the NBA, he came to a Murray State frat party, and he had 20 or 30 guys just surrounding him because he was not going to get caught up in anything at a frat party in Murray, Kentucky. But over time, he's dumped tons of money back into the school and into the community. And I know every year he gives the basketball team some of his signature Nike shoes. That's probably what gave Murray State their image. Now, in all seriousness, I know I was joking around saying I was the top dog, but I did actually live in Murray whenever I went to college. I drove the same streets every day. I grabbed food at all the local restaurants, and I was a part of the campus. Even today, I still know plenty of people who live there or grew up there, or people that just spent their entire lives in that community. So whenever I first learned about what we're talking about today, it didn't feel like a random true crime story from a town I never heard of. It felt kind of weirdly personal because I knew of Murray, Kentucky. And to be honest, whenever I lived there, Murray never felt dangerous. Sure, like any college town, you hear about occasional theft or someone getting arrested after a party. But the idea that this quiet community would ever become more than what it was, and also connected to one of the most strangest and most infamous murder cases of the 90s, that would have sounded ridiculous to come out of Murray. If someone would tell me that there was a group of teenagers that claimed to be 100-year-old vampires, recruiting followers, drinking blood, and spiraling down towards murder, I would have assumed you were talking about a Hollywood movie. I wouldn't think you were talking about, I don't know, this country college.
You know, when I was in middle school, there used to be a popular book series that I used to read, and I can't remember what it was called, but
Was
I
it
remember.
called Circuit du Freak?
No, I remember the main character of the book was Vladimir Todd.
Vladimir Todd. That sounds so familiar, dude.
And I think it was his mom or aunt, something like that, worked at a hospital, and she would bring him home bags of blood so that he could drink that instead of having to go out and get it from
Right.
people.
Imagine taking that fascination with vampire stories and thinking that you are one. It was strange because behind the reputation of one of America's friendliest small towns, a story was quietly unfolding that would capture the national headlines and leave people asking the same questions for decades. How could something this bizarre become connected to a place like Murray? Today's case has been called many names. Some call it the Kentucky Vampire Clan. Others just call it the Murray Vampire Cult. Whatever name you use, the story you're about to hear is very real. It's a story about fantasy becoming an obsession. Obsession becoming manipulation, and then manipulation eventually turning into murder. Roderick Justin Ferrell was born on March 28, 1980, in Murray, Kentucky to teenage parents. Almost immediately, life became very unstable. Shortly after Rod was born, his father left to join the military, leaving his mother, Sandra Gibson, to raise largely by herself. Now, throughout Rod's childhood, the two moved back and forth between Murray and Central Florida, never really staying in one place for very long. When they were in Kentucky, they often lived in public housing. Whenever they lived in Florida, they probably spent most of their time with family members because that's where his mom was from. So obviously you can tell that stability was never really something that Rod experienced from a young age. It was just back and forth and never having a place to actually call home. Now, by all accounts, Rod was an intelligent kid. He had incredible imagination. He loved reading fantasy novels, and he became fascinated with mythology, medieval history, and anything supernatural. Teachers described him as bright, but also socially awkward. He struggled fitting in with other kids his age, and often preferred escaping into fantasy worlds rather than dealing with reality. Then came one of the darkest allegations of his childhood. Years later, during court proceedings, Rod claimed he had been sexually abused by his maternal grandfather beginning around the age of 5. Those allegations become part of the court record and were considered by psychologists evaluating him, but it's important to say that they were never criminal charges against his grandfather, and those allegations were never proven in a court of law. Whether every detail could be verified or not, the mental health professionals involved in this case consistently described Rod's childhood as chaotic, traumatic, and deeply unstable. But perhaps the most unusual influence in Rod's life wasn't his grandfather, it was his own mother. Now, I do want to just butt in here and tell you guys that whenever we tell these things about disturbed people and having bad childhoods, it's not that we're just trying to make up an excuse, but my heart breaks for the child, but not necessarily for the individual that commits heinous acts. I just have a soft spot for kids that go through traumatic events, but it doesn't make up for what he does later on. His mother, Sandra Gibson, wasn't somebody who dismissed the occult or supernatural beliefs. In later interviews, she actually openly admitted that she practiced being a vampire herself and had introduced Rod to those ideas at a young age. She introduced him to a tabletop role-playing game called Vampire: The Masquerade. Now I want to stop here because I know somebody's listening and they're going to say, so this game caused this guy to do this? And I'm going to just nip that right now. Absolutely not. Millions of people have played this game. Hell, I play Dungeons and Dragons with my friends like once a month, and there's countless of other role-playing games without ever hurting any person. No one just goes to playing a game and does this. The game's not always the problem. The problem was that Rod stopped treating it like it was a game. Somewhere during his teenage years, the line between imagination and reality started disappearing. He didn't just create a vampire character to play on game night. He became that character. I'm going to tell you that Rod began calling himself Vasego, claiming that he was a 500-year-old vampire trapped inside the body of a teenager. He told people in his life that he had lived for centuries, and he has been possessed by supernatural abilities, and he wasn't fully human. Now, obviously, to most adults, that sounds pretty ridiculous, right? But to other teenagers who felt like outsiders, who were also searching for identity, acceptance, and somewhere to belong, Rod wasn't ridiculous, he was charismatic. And before long, those teenagers weren't just hanging around him anymore, they were following him.
So does this turn into like an occult issue
Yeah.
or scenario?
Yeah, he kind of just builds up this following of kids that like these weird, dark, macabre things, you know? And that's one of the things that makes this case so fascinating to psychologists and criminologists even today. Rod Ferrell wasn't a middle-aged man with decades of life experience. He wasn't a wealthy televangelist or someone that was living on a compound. He was only 16 years old, yet somehow he was charismatic enough to convince other teenagers that was 500 years old, when in reality he was just a teenager from Kentucky. He convinced them that he was something ancient, something supernatural, and they were loyal to him. They believed it. They thought he was worthy. And that's exactly how a cult begins. You don't start with 100 followers. You don't start with big groups and compounds and barricades. It starts with one charismatic person who convinces a handful of other vulnerable people that they have answers that nobody else has. And Rod did that. By late 1996, his circle had become much more than a group of friends. Members gave themselves vampire identities, and they started wearing gothic clothing almost exclusively. They spent more time with one another than their own families. Nobody called Rod anymore. He expected everybody to call him Vasego, which was his vampire name. According to later testimony, members treated him as the unquestioned leader of the group. Whenever he spoke, people listened. One of the places most commonly associated with the group was an abandoned concrete structure hidden among the woods near the land between the lakes. Locals eventually even began calling this place the Vampire Hotel. Now, despite the name, it wasn't actually a hotel. It was just an abandoned structure that offered privacy. And over the years, there have been countless stories that have circulated about what happened there. Some have almost certainly grown into legend, but investigators and former associates consistently described it as a gathering place where the teenagers would talk about vampires, they would role play, and they would just further separate themselves from reality. Obviously, looking back now, it's easy to see warning signs, but at the time, they looked just like kids being kids. You know, teenagers that wear black clothing, listen to heavy metal music, or read stories about the occult, or watch horror movies, or play these different games. Obviously, none of those things are crimes. Millions of people enjoy those same hobbies every day and never hurt anyone. I know Hunter said it, and I agree that if I had the ability to decorate the house I want to, I'd probably have like serial killer posters or horror movie posters in my house. Like it would look like I'm a gothic dude, and that's not my personality at all. So obviously the danger wasn't really the interest, the danger was Rod himself. Because while everyone else understood that they were pretending, Rod increasingly appeared to believe that he wasn't pretending anymore. As his confidence grew, his control over the people around him grew. His friends became followers, followers became loyalists, and then loyalty meant accepting his versions of reality, even if it kind of conflicted with common sense. Over time, he became less interested in fitting into society and more interested in creating one of his own. Then came Heather Wendorf. Now, Heather wasn't someone Rod had just met. Years earlier, while Rod and his mother lived in Florida, the two had become acquainted. Even after Rod returned to Kentucky, they remained in contact. Heather eventually became drawn into the same worldview that had already captured several teenagers around Murray. She admired Rod, trusted him, and believed the life he described offered something that she wasn't finding at home. According to statements made later during the investigation and trial, Heather often expressed that she wanted to leave Florida. Rod offered her exactly what she wanted to hear. He said, "Come with us. We'll start over, become a family." And he said the destination for their little family was going to be New Orleans. Rod had become fascinated with the city because of its history, all the cemeteries, the folklore, and kind of the connection that New Orleans has to the vampire fiction.
Yeah, doesn't New Orleans have a lot of people that practice black magic?
Yeah, they have a lot of,
Isn't that kind of a part of Mardi Gras?
a little bit. There's some ties to a lot of Caribbean cultures that had came up and settled in the Louisiana area. You have a lot of Dominican people that came up into Louisiana and they intermingled with people that were there that were Spanish, and then French settlers also owned part of that land. And so it's like a melting pot of multiple different nationalities and ethnicities, and that's where you get that Cajun Creole. It's like a mixture of like 4 or 5 different group of people.
What's funny is I've actually worked on some trucks from dudes from like southern Louisiana, and they always sound like a Boomhauer French talking guy. You know,
Yeah.
Boomhauer off of King of the Hill.
Yes, yes.
But it's like a French accent, like a Boomhauer French accent is
Right.
the best way I can describe it.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most unique places in the United States. It's got a mixture of everything, and they kind of blend their history together too, which is why you tend to see some black magic or some hoodoo or voodoo because they have different connections, and so it all kind of gets blended together into this little area. And Rod, he was fascinated by that. He thought it was the coolest thing ever. He thought it was somewhere where Vasego belonged. Now, to everyone else, Florida was simply just along the journey. They would pick up Heather and they would go west, at least until they got to Louisiana.
Go west? Southwest?
Well, west from Florida to Louisiana.
Oh, I thought they were starting from Kentucky. I'm sorry.
Now, he's from Kentucky, but he had.
Right.
Yeah. So they were headed down to Florida to pick up Heather, and then they're going to go west to Louisiana to start their little compound.
Down Interstate 10, I bet.
Yep. At least that's what a lot of members thought was going to happen. But this is exactly whenever Rod decided that Richard and Nawama Wendorf had to die, these being the parents of Heather. Different members of the clan have given different accounts over the years. Some insisted that there was no murder part originally in the plan. Others acknowledged that he had talked about murdering them from the start. He said that her parents were just standing in the way of her leaving. So Rod himself later accepted responsibility for these killings, but his explanations changed over time. But what is clear is that in late November of 1996, Rod Ferrell, Howard Scott Anderson, Charity Kesey, and Dana Cooper left Kentucky and headed towards Central Florida. The drive covered hundreds of miles through multiple states, and to anyone who saw them along the way, they probably looked nothing more than a group of teenagers on a road trip. They stopped for gas, they ate fast food. No one would have guessed the trip would end in one of the most notorious crimes of the decade. And when they reached Florida, they found Heather and they reunited. Now, the group spent some time together preparing to leave Florida, and on the evening before the killings, Rod and several members of the clan visited Audrey Presson. someone they knew in the area. During later court testimony, Preston recalled Howard Scott Anderson saying, quote, "We're going to have some fun tomorrow night." Rod also mentioned that they had unfinished business in Florida. At the time, those comments didn't seem alarming. It wasn't until after the murders that those statements took on a far more chilling significance. So here comes the next day, November 25th, 1996. Heather wanted to see her boyfriend one final time before leaving. Charity Kesey and Dana Cooper drove her to meet him, leaving Rod and Howard Scott Anderson by themselves. Now, while Heather was away, Rod and Scott went to the Wendorf residence. Investigators later determined that they had entered through their garage. Once inside, Rob armed himself with a crowbar that was already in the home. Court records established that Richard Wendorf was attacked while he was asleep or had just been awakened, and that Naomi Ruth Queen Wendorf was also killed during their home invasion after encountering the intruders. The medical examiner documented extensive injuries consistent with repeated blows, and investigators found evidence that Naomi had attempted to defend herself during the attack. Afterward, investigators found signs that parts of the home had been searched, bedroom drawers had been pulled open and emptied out onto the bed, and a telephone inside the home had been disconnected. Prosecutors later argued that these actions show the teenagers were trying to delay discovery of the crime while gathering items before fleeing. Now, one of the creepiest parts about this is that investigators documented that there was a V carved or burned into Richard Wendorf's body, which prosecutors argued represented his fake vampire name, Vasego.
I would agree, but if he's claiming to be a vampire, why would he attack them with a crowbar?
Exactly.
A vampire wouldn't do that.
Exactly.
I figured he would break in that house and go,
Shut up. Yeah, you think he'd go about it in a more stealthy vampire way, fly away like a bat. I don't know.
It sounded like a little pissed off cat inside that house.
Yeah, definitely not a vampire. Now, later on, whenever Heather rejoined the group, they left Florida together in the Wendorf's Ford Explorer. Now, whether every member knew exactly what happened at that moment became a central issue during later proceedings, but by then there was no turning back. The group headed west believing that they were on their way toward a new life, but instead, they had just began a multi-state run that would quickly draw national attention and bring investigators from multiple agencies together in an effort to find 5 teenagers who had vanished after one of the most shocking double murders Florida had seen that year. Now, for Rod, or Vasego, whatever you want to call him, the murders of Richard Wendorf and Naomi Queen Wendorf weren't viewed by him as the ending of a terrible crime. In his mind, they were simply just an obstacle that had been removed. He thought that Heather was now free. The group was together, and New Orleans, the city that he had romanticized for months, was waiting for him. It was delusional at best, but it was a delusion that had consumed every member of that clan from one degree to another. Back in Eustis, Florida, however, reality arrived much sooner than anyone expected. Jennifer Wendorf returned home later that evening with no reason to believe anything was wrong. Like any other day, she pulled into the driveway, expecting to find her parents inside. Instead, she immediately noticed something was off. Now, obviously, the family's blue Ford Explorer was gone. The house seemed unusually quiet, and as she walked through the home, that uneasy feeling quickly turned into horror. There, she discovered her parents dead inside their home and immediately called 911. The dispatcher listened as Jennifer desperately tried to explain what she had found, her voice breaking through tears and panic while deputies raced toward the residence. Lake County Sheriff's deputies were among the first officers to arrive. They quickly secured Jennifer outside the home before entering to determine whether anyone else was inside. What they found confirmed this was no ordinary homicide. Richard Wendorf and Naomi Wendorf had both suffered devastating head injuries, and there was nothing emergency personnel could do for either of them. At that point, they were already gone. Almost immediately, investigators noticed another troubling detail. Heather Wendorf wasn't anywhere inside the residence, or neither was the family's vehicle. And so at that point, investigators couldn't determine whether she had been abducted, had fled in fear, or somehow had been involved herself. With no information to go on, law enforcement issued a statewide BOLO, and if you don't know what that means, it's be on the lookout for the missing vehicle, hoping other agencies might spot it before whoever was responsible could disappear. As more investigators arrived, the Wendorf home transformed into a carefully controlled crime scene. Detectives understood from the beginning that every decision mattered. The smallest mistake could destroy evidence that might later identify the killer. Before anyone began collecting evidence, crime scene technicians photographed the exterior of the home from every conceivable angle. The driveway, the garage, the doors, the windows, and even the yard were documented before investigators ever stepped inside. Once the initial photographs were complete, technicians suited up in protective clothing to prevent contaminating the crime scene, and they began a painstaking examination that would continue for hours. Inside the residence, investigators immediately noticed signs that the crime involved more than murder. They saw the drawers, the master bedroom had been pulled open and dumped across the bed. Jewelry appeared to be missing. Credit cards and other valuables were just gone. The telephone inside the bedroom had been disconnected from the wall. And so that single observation immediately caught attention because it suggested that whoever committed these crimes had taken time to think about what they were doing. Cutting a phone line isn't something that someone just does spontaneously. It's planning, even if it's for a few moments, and detectives began documenting every detail that might later help reconstruct the sequence of events. The forensic examination that followed was exhaustive. Every visible bloodstain was photographed before samples were collected. Investigators measured distances between objects, documented bloody footwear impressions left in the home, and recovered physical evidence that at first glance might have seemed insignificant. A single tooth found near Richard Wendorf's body was carefully preserved. Scrapings were taken from beneath Naomi's fingernails. Clothing, carpet, fibers, fingerprints, and other biological samples were collected from virtually every room that was a part of the attack. Detectives understood they might not know who their suspect is, but this is right whenever modern forensic science was becoming popularized, and they knew that this might solve a case long before they could do without.
So far it sounds like they've done some actually pretty good police work.
Yeah, they were really thorough. Like I said, this is like right at the boom of forensic testing getting big, and so they probably wanted to do it by the book.
Good job.
The next part is the autopsies. And so this provided investigators with an even clearer understanding of what occurred inside that house. The medical examiner testified that Richard Wendorf had suffered extensive blunt force injuries to his head, along with fractures to his ribs and injuries to his chest. The pattern of the wounds was consistent with repeated strikes from heavy metal objects, such as a crowbar, later identified during the investigation. Equally important was what investigators didn't find. Richard showed very little evidence of being able to defend himself, which led investigators to conclude that he was likely attacked while he was asleep or before he fully understood what was happening. But for Miss Naomi, her injuries told a different story. During the autopsy, the medical examiner documented numerous injuries to Naomi's hands and forearms that were consistent with defensive wounds. She had clearly attempted to shield herself from this attack, suggesting that she had remained conscious long enough to realize what was happening and then, try and fight for her life the best she could. Although the medical testimony wasn't necessarily clinical, it did provide investigators with a valuable insight into the sequence of the assault and helped explain why physical evidence had been distributed throughout portions of the residence.
Did he do all this sober?
I don't remember if it ever talked about potential drug use in this.
Could you imagine beating two older people to death with a crowbar sober?
Wild. I couldn't imagine doing it.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, obviously, but the guy's claiming to be a vampire, and he's not even like biting them. I don't know.
He's not sneaky. He's not calculated. He's a 16-year-old, right? Or 17 at this point, I think. He's a teenager. He's not thinking it out. He's not calculated. He's not planning his next step. He's just going in, guns a-blazing.
He's probably on PCP. That was pretty popular in the 90s.
I wouldn't doubt it. Now, while forensic specialists continued processing the home, detectives began reconstructing the victim's final hours, talking to friends, neighbors, relatives, coworkers, anybody else that might have been in contact with them. Every phone call they had gotten the previous day or that day was reviewed. Detectives worked to establish who knew the family's routine, who might have been able to access the house, whether either victim had recently experienced conflict with anybody, and it didn't take long before the attention shifted towards that missing daughter. Obviously, Heather's not there. That's a pretty big clue.
Yeah, when somebody's missing, it's going to go in one or two directions. Either she got kidnapped and she's in harm's way, or she's involved.
Right. Heather Wendorf's disappearance had initially suggested that she might have been another victim, but as investigators dug deeper, another possibility emerged, like you were just saying, Hunter. Friends told detectives that Heather had recently been spending time with an unusual group of teenagers that were from Kentucky. Several witnesses described a young man named Rod Ferrell, who often referred to himself as the name Visego, and claimed to be a centuries-old vampire. Now, at first glance, those statements sounded kind of ridiculous to investigators. Like, if I'm a cop, I'm a detective, and I'm looking at a murder, and I'm interviewing witnesses or anybody else that could help me, and they're like, oh yeah, the daughter was hanging out with some vampire. What would you think? You know, you're going to be like, okay, whatever.
I would definitely think that it was a stupid teenager. I mean, I don't have a daughter, but if I had a daughter and she's hanging out with somebody that had a vampire persona, I probably wouldn't let her hang out with them.
Yeah, I definitely would keep my eyes peeled back. I don't know. I'm scared now that I have a daughter. I hope she doesn't fall for some idiot.
You think he dressed like a vampire every year on Halloween, like trick-or-treating?
You think he had a cape?
Yeah.
And you put those fake teeth in.
Yeah. Trick-or-treat, I need blood.
She fell for some idiot. But the more that police did interviews, these bizarre things became remarkably consistent. One witness in particular would later provide testimony that proved especially significant. Audrey Presson told investigators that Rod and several members of the group had visited her shortly before the murders. During that visit, she talked about how they had said they're going to have fun tomorrow night. Well, Rod explained that they had traveled to Florida because they had unfinished business. Now, like I said earlier, at the time, she didn't think anything of these statements, but after this happened, she came to police and said, hey, I think this is what happened.
Well, good for her. I'm glad that she kind of spoke up and confessed to the knowledge that she had.
Right. Now, meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the members of the vampire clan continued traveling west. They were still planning on getting to New Orleans, but the mood inside the Explorer had changed little from their road trip to Florida. They had stopped for food, they purchased supplies using stolen money from all their credit cards, and then they continued talking about the future as though nothing had happened. Several witnesses along this route who encountered the group during these travels later described them as remarkably calm. Rod didn't appear to be panicked or overwhelmed. Instead, testimony presented during later proceedings said that he behaved normal and remained firm in control of the group. And he made decisions about where they were doing and where they would travel next and how they would spend their time. And they all just followed Rod.
Now, I know he hadn't been caught yet or, went through court proceedings, but was he ever diagnosed a psychopath?
Oh, I don't know. A lot of psychologists and criminologists love this guy's case, and they break down how he has certain traits of other cult leaders. Like, if you look at this guy, he looks like he's nothing special to look at, but he was charismatic, and he was able to control people through his presence, which is something that a lot of cult leaders have in common. And a lot of them do end up being diagnosed as psychopathic or sociopathic over time. So he definitely exhibits a lot of those same qualities.
Yeah, look at Jim Jones. I mean, look how many people he got to follow him. And I mean, he was nothing to look at.
Yeah, he's just a regular guy, but he spoke about something and he spoke about it as if it was the truth, so much that people just believed it. Now, the statewide bolo for the Ford Explorer had quickly spread beyond Florida's borders. As the hours passed by, law enforcement agencies across the Southeast received descriptions of the missing vehicle and the people believed to be inside. Detectives knew they weren't just looking for a stolen SUV anymore. They were looking for individuals that were possibly connected to one of the most brutal double homicides in the region. Ironically, it was this very thing that Rod believed made his group untouchable that ultimately led investigators straight to them. The members of the vampire clan had convinced themselves that they were beginning a new life, but they weren't behaving like people trying to vanish. They just reacted normal. They stopped at restaurants, gas stations, convenience stores. They used the credit cards. They weren't cautious. They got into motels. They left a perfect trail for investigators to find them. They were not trying to be sneaky. Now, while investigators in Florida worked around the clock processing evidence, notifying relatives, and interviewing witnesses, these people just were discussing where they would sleep, what they would eat, and what life would look like once they got to New Orleans. And that illusion finally came crashing down in Baton Rouge. On November 27th, just 2 days after the murders, officers with the Baton Rouge Police Department received information that matched the nationwide alert. Blue Ford Explorer connected to Florida in the parking lot of a Howard Johnson motel. Officers didn't rush in recklessly. They established surveillance, confirmed the vehicle, matched the description, and began coordinating a safe approach. They didn't want a Robert Brasher situation at the hotel.
They didn't want to be attacked by a vampire cult.
They didn't want to become vampires themselves. As officers closed in, they found the teenagers exactly where investigators had hoped they would be. And like I said, this wasn't a dramatic shootout or high-speed chase. Instead, one by one, members of the vampire clan were just taken into custody. Rod Ferrell, Howard Scott Anderson, Heather Wendorf, Charity Kesey, and Dana Cooper. They all suddenly found themselves surrounded by law enforcement. The fantasy that had carried them across multiple states ended in the parking lot of a roadside motel. One officer who later testified described something investigators noticed almost immediately. Even after being arrested, everyone seemed to look at Rod before speaking. Questions directed at one member of the group were often answered only after glancing at Rod first, almost as if they were waiting for permission from their vampire daddy to tell them what to say. He was definitely the leader. Now, while investigators secured the suspects, investigators began searching both the Explorer and the motel rooms, and the amount of evidence obviously was just staggering. They were full of jewelry and credit cards and other belongings from the home. There was clothing that was worn during the murders that was recovered, and investigators carefully preserved every item for forensic testing. There was boots believed to have been worn by Rod Ferrell, along with additional clothing stained with appeared to be blood. Back in Florida, lab testing was already underway. The blood collected from inside the Wendorf home was compared with samples obtained from the suspects. Detectives had photographed bloody footwear impressions throughout the residence, and those impressions were now compared against the boots seized during the arrest. And the results were incredibly significant, right? Experts testified that the impressions were consistent, placing him inside the home of the attack. Biological evidence recovered from beneath Naomi's fingernails matched Rod as well, supporting belief that she had struggled against him during the assault. Blood recovered from Rod's clothing was identified as belonging to Richard, and by the time all the laboratory testing had been completed, prosecutors possessed a mountain of physical evidence that connected him directly to the murders. And yet, detectives still wanted to hear the story from the cult themselves. And so over the next several days, investigators conducted interviews with each member of the group. Not every statement matched perfectly, and over the years, there would be some disagreements about exactly what happened. But one fact became clear. Rod Ferrell had been the driving force. They consistently described him as a person making decisions, giving instructions, and setting up the direction. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to demonstrate that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. They argued the trip had been planned. The victims had been targeted and the murders were committed in the course of robbery and burglary. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, began building a very different picture. Now, they acknowledged that Rod had responsibility, but they argued that his deeply troubled upbringing, alleged childhood abuse, substance abuse at a young age, and significant mental health issues should be considered as mitigating factors.
I kind of hate that the court system does that, because you know how many people grow up with a crappy childhood and have suffered abuse, and how many people have been addicts that's got clean that's never done something so off the wall crazy like this.
Yeah, let me see here. He had childhood abuse, so did I. He had substance abuse, so did I, and significant mental health issues, so did I, and I did not murder anybody, so I think I'm good.
Right.
Right. Now, psychologists evaluated Rod extensively, and the courtroom soon became a battle between competing explanations. Was Rod Ferrell suffering from severe psychological disorders, or was he just a very calculating young man who understood exactly what he was doing? Some experts testified that Rod exhibited serious personality disorders and emotional disturbances rooted in years of instability and trauma. Others obviously disagreed, telling the court that while he certainly had problems, he understood the difference between right and wrong, which is where I tend to lean.
I think that he had a power complex. I think that he felt like he was so unimportant in life, and then he started acting like a vampire, and he's seen that it got people's attention, so he took that, ran with it, and then people started following him, so then he got this big major power complex, and he just had to keep taking it to the next step and the next step, and then it came to murder, which is so very unfortunate. But I honestly think that's what it is. I think he did this out of attention and a power complex.
Right. He knew what he was doing. And according to a lot of witnesses, Rod had admitted that he avoided homes that had security systems because he didn't want to get caught. He also reportedly stated that he avoided targeting homes where young children might be present, so he wouldn't have witnesses. And so to prosecutors, those weren't just thoughts of someone incapable of understanding their actions. They demonstrated that he was fully aware of how to plan and make an effort to avoid detection. Now, when the trial finally began in 1998, many expected weeks of testimony before a jury determined Rod's guilt. But instead, in a move that surprised many observers, Rod changed his plea. He admitted responsibility for the murders, burglary, and robbery, eliminating the need for a lengthy guilt phase.
So did he waive a jury trial?
I think he just pled guilty.
Right, to avoid a jury trial. Like, does the judge determine his sentencing? Or does the jury?
It doesn't necessarily say if he did a judge or jury. A judge would determine what his sentence is if you plead guilty. So he just knew that there was so much evidence against himself, probably made a deal to plead guilty to spare himself the death penalty. Because if you're from Florida or you know anything about Florida, they'll put you in the chair for whatever reason they can.
Yeah, and honestly, they should put this guy in a chair because the mental illnesses backed up behind what he did, not trying to sound heartless, but do we really need somebody like this in society?
Right. Which, at that point, the trial immediately shifted from is he guilty or not to now we know he's guilty, but what is the punishment that he deserves? Now, obviously, for the family of Richard and Naomi, they're like, yeah, he's guilty, but now there's a level of uncertainty. They would never have to wonder whether the evidence was strong enough to secure a conviction. He said he did it, but now they're just wondering, okay, how harsh is he going to be in there? And so prosecutors sought the harshest punishment available under Florida law, while the defense asked the court to consider Rod's age, which was just 16 years old at the time of the murders, and the deeply troubled life that had shaped him. The courtroom would soon hear emotional testimony from psychologists, investigators, family members, and experts on both sides of the case. Those proceedings wouldn't simply determine Rod Ferrell's future. They would force the court to answer a question that continued to divide people nearly 3 decades later. Was he just a disturbed teenager who lost himself into fantasy, or was he a cold, calculated killer?
He's definitely a cold, calculated killer. How do you beat an older couple together with a crowbar?
Right.
Sober. Like I said in another episode, like, people can smoke weed and do this and that. Like, I've never heard of anybody smoking weed wanting to kill people. You typically hear about it when people's drunk or on, like, cocaine or meth or something like that.
Something wild.
But to be able to do this at 16 years old, fully sober.
It's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wild. I just can't personally process that in my head. So yeah, I think he's a cold, calculated killer. I don't think anybody should show him any form of sympathy. Because even like you said, so many people have had child abuse, substance abuse, mental illness, and they're not out doing terrible things like this. So why should we give one person sympathy if all these other people out here deal with the same thing?
Right. And so it just ends up becoming an excuse, I feel like, and eventually the court's torn. They don't know how to sentence this guy. And so now
Old Yeller treatment, take him behind the barn.
they leave it up to a jury. So the jury hears discussions from criminologists and psychologists. They hear about his childhood. They talk to parents, siblings, coworkers, people that are around him. They talk to the victims' families, and the jury ultimately agreed with the prosecution's assessment of the crime, and they unanimously recommended that Rod Ferrell receive the death penalty for the murders of Richard Wendorf and Naomi Wendorf. At the time, the decision made national headlines because Rod had become the youngest person ever on Florida's death row. The image of a teenager awaiting execution captivated newspapers and television across the country, fueling more attention on a case that had already become one of the most unusual investigations of the decade. But Rod wasn't the only person whose future would be decided in court. Remember, I said that he went with one of his companions, Howard Scott Anderson, who had accompanied Rod into the Wendorf home. Eventually, he entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony, he received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after serving a substantial portion of that sentence. Heather Wendorf, whose relationship with Rod had set the tragedy in motion, she's their daughter, pleaded guilty to burglary and second-degree murder under Florida's felony murder rule. Although she had not entered the house during the killings, prosecutors argued that her participation in the underlying crimes made her legally responsible for the deaths that followed. Charity Kesey and Dana Cooper, who had traveled with the group, but were not inside the home during the attacks also entered plea agreements and received prison sentences for their roles in the burglary and related offenses.
I don't agree with that. If they weren't even with them when they committed a crime, because I mean, would they charge them with accessory after the fact?
Well, they knew
That's what I'm saying.
they were proving that not just after the fact, but prior to the murders, that they had taken and dropped those guys off to do it, and they went to another place to kind of have an alibi.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right. So for years, Rod remained on Florida's death row. Appeals moved slowly through the courts while attorneys challenged various aspects of his conviction and sentence. Then, in 2005, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in Roper v. Simmons, ruling that executing individuals for crimes committed before they turned 18 violated the Eighth Amendment against cruel or unusual punishment. That decision fundamentally changed Rod's case in many cases of people on death row for cases they committed before they were 18. Across the country, all these cases had to go back to court. His death sentence could no longer stand. Years later, following additional hearings required by changes in juvenile sentencing law, his punishment was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. So legally, the case was over, but for many people in Murray, Kentucky, and for Florida, the story never really ended. The media certainly knew which version sold more papers. Almost overnight, they said Rod Ferrell became known as the vampire killer, and they plastered his photograph on TV, and a lot of right-wing news channels were talking about blood rituals, Satanism, and the vampire culture. America was already in the middle of what people would now refer to as
satanic panic.
Right. Although much of the moral panic had begun fading by then, stories involving occult practices, cults, role-playing games, and anything supernatural still got a lot of attention in the media.
No, the satanic panic was still around because this was just, I think, a couple years after the West Memphis 3. And I remember the West Memphis 3 had a big satanic panic thing around it.
Right. So it's just all building up. And over the years, the story had been told countless times. In 1998, British television aired a documentary called The Kentucky Teenage Vampires, which was like an early attempt to explain what happened. Then there was a 2002 film called Vampire Clan, which was like a way to dramatize the murders. Since then, Rod Ferrell and the Vampire Clan have appeared in numerous television programs, including Killer Kids, The Unexplained, hosted by William Shatner, Deadly Cults, and several true crime documentaries and podcasts.
Including Crime Daddies now.
Right. And every production seems to focus on a different part of the story. Some lean heavily into the vampire mythology, others focus on Rod's childhood, some portray him as a monster from the very beginning, others emphasize instability and abuse and neglect that shaped his early life. Crime Daddy's perspective, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, in a very uncomfortable space between those two extremes. Rod Ferrell wasn't born believing that he was a 500-year vampire, but he also wasn't simply a misunderstood teenager. He took 2 lives.
Let me ask you this. Is this guy still alive?
Yes.
Do you think that we should send him some garlic, a silver cross, and a picture of the sun?
He might fall apart. He has done a lot of different interviews from prison, and I was reading some, and he looks a lot different. He's trying to change the way he looks to be perceived differently. But I think this is one of the cases that really sticks with me. It's easy to laugh how crazy it seems for a bunch of teenagers to say, oh, we're vampires now. Let's go kill somebody. But underneath all that is something that we've seen over and over again on this podcast. You find someone who's charismatic and finds himself around vulnerable people, and fantasy slowly replaced reality. Nobody stepped in before things got out of control, and by the time everyone realized just how dangerous things could be, 2 people innocently lost their life. For me, this story hits a little different because of where it began. I lived in Murray. I walked the campus of Murray State. I know people who still call that town home. Even today, whenever people hear Murray, Kentucky, some people just think about a quiet college town, while some people think of the Murray vampire cult. It was a story of a handful of teenagers whose lives collided in the worst possible way, and it's a reminder that sometimes the most unbelievable true crime stories don't happen in big cities or places known for violence. Sometimes they happen in the friendliest small town in America, and that's the Murray vampire cult.
What a total asshole.
Yeah, he's a douchebag. I'm going to show you some pictures. You'll look at him and think, yeah, this guy definitely had a big ego.
Rest in peace to the victims, and our condolences go out to their families. They by no way deserved what happened to them. It is definitely disturbing, to say the least, very heartbreaking. And when I hear about cases like this, it makes me try to get into the mindset of the perpetrator or the killer. And nobody's two brains are made the same, and that's probably why I can't understand or relate. But could you imagine having this inside of your head and actually committing an act like this? I mean, to beat somebody brutally with a crowbar is just so crazy. And to act like a vampire, like,
Yeah. All because you wanted some girl to leave. Like, she could have just came with you. Why would you have to kill her parents for her? She could have just ran away. Could have just ran away. You didn't have to kill anybody. They weren't stopping you from being a vampire. No one was stopping you from being a weirdo.
in my opinion, it was over a power complex because he probably, being the leader of this cult, was like, see what I did to these innocent people, and you don't think I won't do it to you?
Yeah, he definitely wanted to show why he's a leader. He wanted to put pen to paper and say, this is me. I'm Vasego. I'm a 500-year-old vampire, and he wanted them to believe him. I bet they were challenging his ego, and he had to do something to establish dominance, like you said.
Right.
It's power, it's control, it's a way for him to come from a childhood where he had none of that to now have it, and he didn't want to get rid of it.
Well, Jacob, that was an absolutely crazy case. If you guys enjoyed this story, definitely, I know you didn't enjoy the crime itself because that is brutal and disgusting. But if you enjoyed the way me and Jacob told this story, then please, down in the comments, tell us about it.
Right. And if you guys want to hear more about this or hear interviews from the people involved, there are so many different podcasts and documentaries and movies about this. It's really popular. The reason why I covered it, because it's kind of local. Murray is only a few hours away from us. It's still considered the heartland of America, which is where we're from. So, and it has a ties to where I used to come, even though the murder happened in Florida. But it's just interesting. So, like Hunter said, if you're interested and you enjoyed the way we told the story, let us know.
And please, everybody, leave us those 5-star reviews. We can't tell you how much it helps us out. It really, really does, to help get us pushed out on the algorithm. And we're not trying to beg you guys to do it, but for the time me and Jacob spend every week to make these podcasts happen, we only ask of you all to please leave us 5-star reviews and interact with us on our socials and on Spotify and YouTube. And again, we're still stupid and we can't get into Apple Podcasts to reply back to your review comments, but maybe, hopefully one day we'll figure it out.
We're independent as it gets. We are just figuring it out. And there's some days where we're like, oh crap, this does this, or I can look at this, and it's just we're figuring out along with you guys, and we appreciate you guys more than anything. So yeah, those 5-star reviews mean the world to us, and it's a little agreement we have. It's a contract that's not written down. We provide you guys weekly episodes every Tuesday at 5 a.m. and you give us 5-star reviews and likes and comments on social media. That's our little agreement we have with our listeners, and we appreciate everybody that takes the time to do it. Even if you don't do it, we still welcome you here at Crime Daddies. I'm not going to put a gun to your head and tell you what you got to do, but I do want to let you guys know it is important to us, and it helps us a lot more than you think. Now, without further ado, we're going to wrap this up, and I'm going to let you guys know to please go to our social media. You can find us at Crime Daddies Pod on Instagram. I've been doing a lot of work on getting that up and running. If you want to go see pictures from the crime itself, we post them on there every week, and you can go and see those every Wednesday. We drop the episode on Tuesday, and I post it on Wednesday for you guys to see pictures. We don't post like anything super gory. We just post some stuff that doesn't have any victims in it, but we do post so you guys can see what these people look like and some context to the story. I know I like to have a physical aspect to whenever I'm listening to a podcast. You can find us on Facebook at Crime Daddies, and you can find my personal Facebook at Jacob Smith on Facebook, and then Instagram and TikTok is Jacob W.C. Smith. These are our personal accounts, and you can see some more behind the scenes stuff. And for Hunter, you can find him
on Facebook. I am Hunter Ben Frampton. On TikTok, I am Simo_Hunter. And on Instagram, I am Hunter.Simo.
And last but not least, if you go to crimedaddies.riverside.com, this is where you can go ahead and subscribe to us, and it costs $0.00 to be a part of a exclusive group that gets insight to new episodes. And you guys also get insight to the Crime Daddies Digest, which is a monthly newsletter we do. And then you can also, on our social medias, find different links to different things. So go ahead and check those out. We have a bunch of cool things. But other than that, that's all I got for you.
Remember, everybody, listen to the crime, don't be the crime.
Yep.